Folks, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Others will catch up as they join. Welcome to today's webinar presented by T4S Partners and Ivanti. This is the first of a three-part series on IT asset configuration management. This is part one, entitled Crawl, the Foundation of IT Asset Management. And 2 weeks from today, we will continue with our second installment entitled Walk, Analysis and Action for IT Asset and Configuration Management. So for today's agenda, Rob, if you could advance, thank you. After I make some introductions here in a minute, for today's webinar, we're going to cover really primarily two topics, folks. Number one being critical best practices for asset and configuration management. And number two, we are going to intersperse with these best practices actual demonstrations of how these best practices can be achieved using the Ivanti platform, okay? Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, if you've got questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to register your questions in the Zoom chat. We'll have ample time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you may have. And the other thing is we're going to actually be aware that we're going to ask a couple of poll questions. So there's a little bit of an audience participation. There's two poll questions that we would like your feedback on, in order to kind of better help us understand what companies are actually doing in this space, okay? All right, so before we go on, let me properly introduce today's speakers. I'd like to, first of all, before I introduce the experts for today's webinar, let me introduce myself. I'm Bert Lassley. I've spent the past 30 years in the IT arena, in the past 15 specifically in the ITSM and ITIL space, in the last 6 specifically working with Ivanti. I'll really be your bookend for today's call, meaning that I'm going to talk a little bit here in the very beginning, and then I'll help field the questions at the end. I really want to introduce the two experts, though, for today's call. Number one, I'd like to introduce Rob Ferrillo. He's a 25-year veteran. He is the ITAM lead at Ivanti, and Rob is a member of the International Association of ITAM. He's a true expert in this field, and he will be doing the demonstrations for us today. I would also like to introduce Paul Bussiere. Paul is an accomplished enterprise architect with over 20 years of experience. He specializes as well in the IT service management, specifically around best practice processes, such as business service management and service and asset and configuration management. So what I'd like to do is, turn it over to them here in a minute. But before I do so, one of the things I'll let everybody know in the audience, two things. One, the emails and the LinkedIn links have been provided here. You'll all get a copy of this deck after the presentation. Feel free, if you need to contact any of us at the conclusion of the session, we can do so. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. I've got one slide, folks, that I really want to focus on. I spent a little time kind of setting up what you're going to see today and what we're actually going to present. And as you know, asset and configuration management have been around for a long time. Really started to become a problem with the introduction of client server computing, and it's continued now and really kind of exacerbated itself to another level with cloud computing and adoption. So what's driving this market? Okay, and the main reason is that technology, part of the premise is technology has finally caught up with the market drivers. There's a plethora of technology out there today, however, but you still have to consider the people and the process in order to achieve the results you're typically looking for, and those are typically around these three primary topics, which are cost savings, service improvement, and compliance. Okay, so we're going to kind of demonstrate. We're going to talk about best practices. We're going to talk, give you specific demonstration of how the products can actually manifest itself and help with these problems. But let me talk a little bit more first about each one of these points. First of all, on the significant cost savings. If you lack an effective asset management program, this typically leads to technology sprawl. In other words, if you have a lack of visibility into your company's assets, which are not deployed and are yet available, then you're constantly ordering new assets when the existing assets could have been redeployed. So this is one of the age-old problems. And one of the things that we're demonstrating today is how we go about doing automated discovery and populating your asset repository or your CMDB. So that's number one. Number two, really on the unplanned downtime. Yes, we all know that, they always blame it specifically the outages on a configuration, improper configuration, or a change management issue, specifically around those processes. And that is true. It is those processes that have the problem, but more than likely, it's really due to the lack of visibility to downstream dependency effects. And one of the things that we'll demonstrate in our next session is technology and business service dependency mapping. I know that's a mouthful, but it's something that's kind of key, and it's really cool when you actually see it. The last point on here is really that most companies have more software than is actually being used. And I think a lot of the companies and a lot of you that are on here can relate to that. Oftentimes your company is oversubscribed in some areas and you're undersubscribed in others. Well, being undersubscribed is an area where you really need to be concerned. This is where the compliance comes in, because true ups and fines can be extremely expensive with your software vendors. And we'll talk a little bit about the best practices of lifecycle management today, and then we'll demonstrate some of the effective dashboard technology that provides visibility into your company's software and hardware inventories. So folks, the way that we set up this session is that we'll have Paul kind of present the best practice, focus primarily on the people and the process. And Rob will then demonstrate the best practice using the Ivanti platform, okay? We've also selected 3 best practices, and we realize there's many, many more, but we're gonna cover these kind of, during the course of this, short session. One of them is specifically around design. There's another one on the life cycle, and then there's one on policy and governance, okay? So we're gonna show you those three things. We're gonna talk about them. Paul will set them up and Rob will demonstrate them. That's how the session will go. So let's shift gears now to Paul and Rob, who are going to review some of the best practices and technologies that can address these issues. So Paul?
Yep. Thank you, Ben. All right. So when we think about the, when we start this process, obviously, the first thing we need to look at is, obviously, let's define what we're talking about when we think about IT asset configuration management. And what does that really mean, right? And so, this is critically important because, they're 2 very different processes, and the terms are often used interchangeably, which can cause confusion and which will impact your project, right? So, and your project success. This is a very common problem that we see, where in which, the understanding of the ultimate outcome that you're going for is not clearly defined. And as we all know, from a project perspective, how can your project be successful if your outcome is not clearly defined, right? So success is all, how do you measure success, right, without it being well defined? Well, of course, in this case, there is no difference in this case. We need to clearly understand what it is, the outcome we're going for, and how does that align to these various different processes while they're very intertwined, and we'll look at that in more depth later. That is, it's very critical to understand, because of course, everything will be driven based on what that outcome is ultimately looking at. So just to summarize, configuration management focuses on relationships and the relationships within a given system, right? So really what we're focusing on there is, again, making sure that we understand that the interaction between various systems that you have in your organization and how they talk to one another, right? What dependencies they may have on each other. From an IT asset management perspective, on the other hand, that's really focusing on the financial aspects of equipment and software and leveraging how well you're leveraging your investments in those particular areas, right? So again, as Bert talked about, from one of the outcomes around unused software and that kind of aspect, that goes directly into how do I leverage my software effectively? Are my customers utilizing the software I purchased for them? All of those conversations dive directly into the IT asset management capability. Next slide. So what we've done is, T4S is we put together this maturity pyramid that we like to call it. The maturity pyramid is really focused around outcomes. These outcomes build upon each other and kind of a progressive process and a data perspective. So there's two aspects that we're looking at, from a process as well as data. The purpose here is to provide you with an obtainable goal at the various different levels that at which, and that outcome, of course, will be clearly articulated and the project be well defined, right? So back to what I was mentioning earlier, we need to be clearly defining our ultimate objective, and let's do that here with the way we've defined it, right? And because again, that dependency becomes very important. At each level of the pyramid, there are activities that are required to achieve that level, as well as process and data requirements. So if we talk about the various different levels here, at the bottom layer, what we see is this asset repository or CI repository. Again, this is really sort of a collection of information regarding the assets or the CIs that you have in your system. At this layer, the differentiation between the process as well as the data elements that you have are pretty much, they're basically the two sides of the same coin, essentially. Because the same, again, what we're doing is we're just building a repository. Now, this repository can provide some value, right? So we can leverage from an ITSM, from a CI perspective, we've been tying those assets or those CIs to various ITSM processes like incident, service request, other kinds of things like that. We can also understand, requests for change and other kinds of things like that can all play a role in leveraging that information, right? But as we want to drive additional value, we begin to move up that pyramid. And what you'll see is the processes and the data elements will begin to diverge there. So at the second layer, we start to then move in from a configuration management perspective. We're now looking at impact analysis. This is an area where we want to look at or maintain or understand the relationships, right? That becomes very important at this layer, and being able to utilize that from a change impact analysis or incident impact analysis perspective, right? So that will, of course, drive down, incident impact analysis will drive down your mean time to resolve, as well as from a change impact analysis that will drive down your mean time between failures, right? Technically drive that up is really what we want. We want a very long time between failures, of course. From an asset lifecycle perspective, right? This is on the asset side. That's the next level. So now we have assets. We have our asset repository. We now start to apply the overall lifecycle analysis to that. So we start to look at how do we acquire equipment? How do we decommission equipment? How is that being used? Are we reclaiming equipment? Are we reusing that equipment? All of that becomes available at that second layer. As we move up again into the third layer around configuration management, this is where we start to look at service management. So the difference between impact analysis and service management is what is the logical entity that we're understanding or we're defining impact around. So at service management, really the focus is around defining a logical entity in the service that you deliver to your customers. Now you need to understand what that ultimately looks like. That's something that is defined within your business. And we can wrap various entities or processes around that, begin to expand that. So things like service level management becomes very important and other kinds of things, because we really need to begin to define. And this, and again, when we talk about service, it's different than what we deliver for a service request. That's services for users. What we're talking about here is business service management, which is really what are those top level services that we're delivering to our business. And then that takes into account all of the equipment and services and capabilities that's required to deliver that. And again, one flip side here as well is when we talk about defining what a service is, that's defined from the customer's perspective. That's key. So again, the perspective that we change from impact analysis to service management, that perspective is very different. On the asset management side, we want to move up into software asset management. I differentiate these, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the process side. But this is very important that we understand their life cycle, because of course, software runs on equipment. We need to understand the life cycle of that equipment to properly understand what software we have and how well we utilize that software. And then at the top layer here, we've capped it at level 4 here, because this is typically what we've seen out in the environment, where we typically see folks attempt to achieve initially. There are levels above this. Obviously, we begin to combine a lot of these processes together. And certainly if somebody's interested in that, we can delve into that level as well. But at the top level, from configuration management, this is where we move from service management, business service management, understanding your services and beginning to quantify and understanding the relationships. We move into service availability. This is where we start to pull in significantly more information regarding how well we're delivering that service. So now it's not a lot understanding of what kind of impact do we have, where is that impact coming from. Now we're looking at what is the overall quality of service that we're providing within that service, that business service, right? So what, I can proactively begin to look at, are we having interruptions of service? Are we going to have interruptions in service? Are we having, do we have bottlenecks throughout the entire chain of delivery for that service, those kinds of activities. So the amount of information and the level of maturity is very significant at this level, because of course, what we're looking at is very nuanced related information associated to your business, or your business service, excuse me. And then on the asset side, this is where we start to get into financial planning, right? So really, ultimately, the outcome of asset management is really around providing planning, and we want to be able to properly plan for the spend coming up in the new year. So if you know how many people you're onboarding on, generally speaking, what your overall turnover is, you can begin to now start to look at, and you have a full understanding of what your software and your assets are. You can now understand what it is your actual spend is going to look like moving forward, right? So this becomes something very significant as we took it from a financial perspective, controlling your assets and controlling your spend, from a full life cycle perspective. Okay. Next slide. So this is our first poll question. So the first poll question here is, does your company have an initiative that aligns with one of these outcomes, right? Feel free to mark more than one that apply. What we want to do here is kind of understand, capture, does your company already currently have a repository? Are you, attempting to try to achieve impact analysis, or are you going for, we need full asset financial planning, right? Is that an objective you're attempting to try to achieve today? If so, I'm interested to understand what that looks like, and understand how, what the group looks breakdown is. Right, we're gonna great attendance. Wow.
Excellent participation. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. Again, this, as we move up the chain, right, again, the level of information, and it becomes just a, we talk about the fact that as we move up, the deviation of that information, and as you can talk about, again, we're focusing, from an asset perspective, we're going to focus more closely on what we're doing from a financial perspective. And then we think about those things above, those level 5, if we want to, that's where we begin to actually combine these two capabilities together, where we can start to look at what is my overall cost of the services that we deliver and those kinds of things. So there are levels above this. We can take this and kind of, but really what that looks like is a combination of all of these two, where we see these two begin to really combine. All right.
And Paul, if I can just kind of relate this in Ivanti terms, like from a product perspective, the left half of the pyramid here really focuses on the Ivanti service management, ITSM. It's had several names over the years. Some folks call it ISM, ITSM, neurons for ITSM, but it's really the service management aspect. On the right half of the pyramid, we're really talking about Ivanti's ITAM solution, neurons for ITAM. And that's working together in the same platform on the same database to accomplish similar goals, right? On the configuration management side, we're really talking about CIs, and we're worried about how that's going to impact our changes and providing the best service management to our customers. On the asset side, we definitely can leverage all of that great information. We've got very much aligned goals, but we're more kind of focused on who owns the assets and where are they, right? How long have they been into service? How many do we have in stock? How many are coming next week? How many need to be retired? And moving up the ladder with, are we using, the software licenses that we've acquired most effectively? And are we covered across the board? And can we project out back to the business what we're going to need next year and how we're trending and things like that? So the pyramid really does apply kind of specifically to the Ivanti solution set, service management on the left side, and ITAM on the right side.
Yep. Perfect. And the results of the poll is interesting. There's a lot of focus on asset lifecycle management, which is great. A lot of focus on building the repository. Obviously, again, we talk about these data elements are sort of combined, but we also have some service management and asset financial planning, which is great. About 40% of us, 45% are looking at service management, which is great. All right.
All right.
So from a best practices perspective, we're going to review, as Bert mentioned, 3 best practices that we think are critical. These best practices are focused around our 3 tenets, right? People, process, and technology. It's important that we consider these 3 aspects as we look at or look to create an initiative for IT asset or configuration management process or project. These are critical, right?
And Paul, just to put on my Ivanti hat, right? So Ivanti has a tremendous relationship with IAITAM. I'm not sure if the folks on the call have heard of IAITAM. It's the International Association of IT Asset Managers. I'll tell you, they're not known for their wild keg parties. Okay. What they are known for is being the experts when it comes to IT asset management best practices. If you think of ITIL really being the best authority on service management, these folks are the authority when it comes to asset management. And the reason why it's so important that I bring it up is not only I've been lucky enough to be certified by them, it was the greatest 4-day investment that I've ever made. And then I encourage you to go to iaitam.org and look them up. They have virtual classes and all sorts of great things. But we consulted hand in glove with IAITAM when we built out the workflows and the processes within the ITAM solution. So like our ITIL in a box on the service management side, this is IAITAM in a box. The workflows, the processes are all adhering to the IAITAM best practice standards. And so when you start with the Ivanti ITAM solution, you're already starting with the best practices included.
Okay. All right, so best practice number 1, so the first best practice that we're going to be talking about today is understanding your data, right? So this is, of course, our technology best practice. We got to focus around understanding what it is, what data elements you have. So as we saw in the pyramid, this is a fundamental step in achieving a value, is building a CI repository or an asset repository. All things are built upon this layer, right? In most cases, we can be relatively prescriptive unless there are unique CIs or assets that need to be captured. An example of these would be things like, of these unique assets or CIs could be something like the Internet of Things, the IoT. That's very common. There are elements out there, that everything now has, an IP address and, some type of management interface. And so there are, certain levels of importance depending on what types of devices those are, and we can bring those in. So those are things that are typically sort of outside of the norm, but certainly those are things that are important and we can bring them in. Another example would be things like medical devices. Again, there are many medical devices now are all, remote managed and that kind of thing, have some type of capability associated and have an IP address. Well, we want to know what they are. We want to know if they're on our network. We want to know what they are. We want to know what they're doing, and provide at least some information. Right. This becomes very important, obviously, from a security perspective. If it's on our network, and we need to know what it is. Right. It's got an IP address. And then one of the other areas is sort of kind of coming forth and really kind of starting to kind of define its own class would be the containers and Kubernetes and those kinds of activities. So as we begin to move, fully into containerization on servers, this becomes very important to understand how we're going to manage containers and how important we manage those containers, and then the configuration around those containers within we think about Kubernetes and what it does. How are we going to articulate that in the context of a service map and so forth, right? So this becomes very important to sort of like as we extend kind of beyond the traditional CIs and assets. But as we look at this, most commonly what we deal with is, defining our containers or classes in a way that's meaningful and that provides functionality to support your key asset or CI capabilities, right? So things like, for example, your standard would be computer class. This is your end user computing, your mobile devices, your network devices. Mobile devices are important mainly for the purposes of understanding if they're going to be on your network. We need to know what they are. And certainly the other thing is going to be around whether or not they're yours or they're someone else's. Sometimes, in some cases, there are certain companies where if there is software that's important that you need to manage through the mobile devices, that becomes very, something that needs to be managed. So we need to know about those devices and manage them effectively. Network devices, obviously, servers, physical, virtual. From a configuration management perspective, just to get into some weeds here, there are things like applications and application instances that become those are a specific class that would be built out or would need to be addressed when we think about configuration management. Or certainly databases. That's a logical entity. Obviously, we think about it, in a different way in many cases. But really, from a configuration management perspective, that's a logical entity that we may need to substantiate independently, right? Depending on whether or not we want to understand its importance in the context of a service. And then, of course, asset management, software licenses. This becomes very important. And we want to pull that information in. We want to make it available, even if your asset management capability or your ITAM capability may be somewhat separate. We want to pull that into your ITSM capability as well, so that we can leverage that from a service request perspective. And we'll talk about that a little bit more about how we want to leverage ITSM in the context of ITAM. I'll wrap that around it so that we can leverage that same capability. All right, we're moving right into our first demonstration here. This is going to be around discovery connectors.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. Let me just drag over my web browser page here. We're going to do a demonstration on discovery. And to start with, Neurons as a platform has a tremendous amount of functionality and great things in it. There's geolocation, there's self-healing bots, there's software asset management, there's a bunch of great things. But today, we're really just going to focus on discovery. So I'm going to come over here into my discovery area. And, we're a cloud-based solution. So the first thing that you would do if you chose to go forward with Ivanti's discovery is you would install a deployment representative in your network. That is just a Windows box that, could be a desktop or a server that you load our agent on. And then once that's loaded, the first thing you'll do is come in and specify, I want it to scan these IP ranges, right? So I put in an IP range of my home. And if you notice down below here, there's checkboxes, kind of really walks you through what our discovery process will do. The first thing is find if the IP address is active through ICMP, do a ping, see if it responds. If so, the next step is determine what operating system we're dealing with. That's important because Windows, Mac, network devices use different remote inventory protocols. We'll use WMI for doing a remote inventory of Windows, SSH for Linux, Mac, SNMP for network gear and other types of devices. And so through this process, we'll see if an IP address is active, we'll detect the operating system, and then we'll give it a full inventory. Now, obviously, to get that inventory, you're going to have to supply the system credentials. So there's an area here where you can add your credentials in, and it will, be able to use those to authenticate and do an agentless inventory of the device. Now, this is an active-based scan. So in order to find the device in this method, the device would have to be online at the time when the scan runs, which is great for fixed, computers that don't get up and walk away, non-mobile devices. But for mobile devices, for machines that were off, that come on later after the scan, we've got a secondary net to catch you, and it's called passive discovery. With our passive discovery, as soon as the machine comes online and makes a network request, we'll compare to see whether or not we've already discovered it. And if so, if not, we'll follow up and do the discovery at that point. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. And once you've run a discovery, you'll start to see all of these discovered devices come back. Now, again, this is a scan of my home, and some people laugh at me and call me a nerd because I've got over 70 IP addresses active, and that's fine. I get it. I am very technical, but you can see I found everything from my Ring doorbell to my Guns N' Roses pinball machine, to just about everything within my environment, all of my light bulbs and switches and all of my gear. And when available, when there's an operating system that we can detect and we can scan, we'll get a full inventory of that device. You'll see that showing up over here because a policy has been able to be applied to it. We'll discover the light bulb, but obviously we can't get a full inventory of it. But when we discover Windows and Linux and Mac and SNMP gear, we will get a full inventory of it. Now, let's pretend for a second that we discover a machine like this Windows 10 device out there, and we find that it's actually a Dell laptop as part of its discovery. We know its make and model and service tag, but what we could never discover is, did you buy the 3-year warranty or the 5-year warranty? Do you have next day service or 5-day service? We don't know that, and we'll never be able to discover it. But we can bring that data in using one of our 38 different connectors that will bring in data from third-party data sources and augment that asset record, that CI record, with additional information. So from a hardware and software discovery, we know its operating system and what's running on it. But from these connectors, you can pull in its warranty information from Dell. If you've purchased it through Insight or CDW, it's purchasing information and PO information. And then there's a whole bunch of other connectors here that you'll see. Obviously, the entire fleet of Ivanti solutions integrates into the Neurons platform, but there's lots of great third-party connectors. So O365, Azure, and standard Microsoft Active Directory, AWS, Rapid7, Tenable, ServiceNow, et cetera, VMware. So when we discover an asset, we can augment or enrich that asset record with things like its guest to host relationship, or its vulnerabilities, or its risk score from Rapid7. If you're using an alternate discovery product, that's fine. We think Ivanti's discovery is the best. But if you're using something like Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Endpoint Configuration Manager, formerly SCCM, we can bring that data in as well. Now let's talk about devices that we'll never be able to discover. I was dealing with a school system just last week, and they told me that they had 20,000 Google Chromebooks that they've distributed to students that never check in on their network. They never connect via VPN. They never connect via the network anymore. They're all remote, work from home, learn from home devices. So how do we get the discovery information on those? Well, we can tap into the enrollment systems, Google Chrome Enterprise, or Microsoft, formerly Intune, now Endpoint Manager, where we can bring in all of your mobile devices that have been enrolled and managed in a third-party system and bring those into the CMDB seamlessly. Also, if you're a Mobile Iron customer, of course, we've got a connector for that as well. And these connectors really, this is really the core technology behind the Neurons platform. It is a device reconciliation engine. One of the reasons why many CMDB projects have failed in the past is because customers have asked the CMDB to do too much. You're asking it to take 37 different data feeds from all these different data sources and reconcile and deduplicate assets and normalize the data that's within there. And it's just overwhelming to do all of that and provide the day-to-day operations to impact analysis for change management, ticketing, and the ongoing lifecycle management within the asset. So what Neurons allows us to do is offload that into a purpose-built system whose sole job is to deduplicate assets, normalize the data, set it up across multiple data sources, and feed it into the CMDB so that it's fully enriched when it arrives. So if there are any questions, feel free to chat them in. We're happy to answer them on the spot here. Anything in chat, Paul, that maybe you see that we should address right away? Or let's see. How does Neurons compare with Sharewell Asset Management? Great question. So Sharewell Asset Management is a similar type of discovery product, but we are migrating customers from Sharewell Asset Management CAM onto Neurons Discovery. You'll get very, very close, probably 98% of the same exact information. I don't want to say 100% because there are a couple of things that CAM did uniquely, but there's some great benefits that you'll get by adding the Neuron or migrating to the Neurons platform. So they're very similar. Depending on what level of Sharewell Asset Management you currently own. If you own it, there are equivalent Neurons components, and I encourage you to reach out to your sales team for maybe a more personalized information session and demonstration. Lenovo, I see the next question is Lenovo is a connector that is on the roadmap for later this year. And I believe we'll start to see the beta of it within the next month or two. I'm not part of product management, so I don't make any promises on specific timelines for releases, but I do know that that is coming down the pipe. CAM does not have two-way communication to retired devices. Okay, so we're going to get into retirement in just a little bit. Yes, the Sharewell CMDB is where you would do your asset lifecycle management, your ongoing lifecycle management, Jack. And similar in the Ivanti world, the Neurons for Discovery would be the CAM area where you do the discovery, and the CMDB or asset repository is where we're going to do the next demonstration, and we're going to show the ongoing lifecycle management from there. Will the Neurons connector go to Fair Scout? I don't believe we have one for that today. For Scout, we can do some investigation and see if that's on the roadmap. What is the role of EPM discovery? So if you're an on-prem EPM customer, or if you have requirements for on-prem discovery, then EPM would be your solution. There is a connector to bring your EPM data into the CMDB, similar to the discovery that you would get from Neurons. So it's just a matter of if you require on-prem, EPM is your preferred mechanism or your choice. If you're preferring cloud-based discovery, Neurons for Discovery is the way to go, and it is definitely the future. Okay, there is a migration for CAM. I'm not a salesperson. I encourage you to reach out to your salesperson to find out the details of that. But there is a migration path for you, and there is some like-for-like migration for you. Okay. I want to be careful of time, so let's go ahead and move forward. We'll continue to try to answer questions as we go. Okay, get this out of the way.
Great. Thank you, Rob. So the next step is we're going to talk about a process. So here's our process best practice. So really what we have here is demonstrating or looking at a high level, what is the full life cycle from a hardware from an asset as well as configuration management perspective. I separate, there's one area that I focus on in this time, talked a little bit about, from the questions around CAM versus, Sharewell and kind of what that, how do you manage those two items? And of course, as Rob talked about within the context of Ivanti as well, the aspect of discovery will focus around one specific area. CAM specifically, I can talk about is that's where you're performing your software asset management. That is a software asset management tool, and so your software life cycle will be managed within the CAM tool, but your hardware asset life cycle needs to live within this CMDB, right? And the reason for that is, of course, the purposes for that is to align those processes or intertwine those processes with ITSM, right? Because we want all of these activities to be essentially day-to-day activities. We don't want to have a specific process, while we have a defined process that is specific for asset management, there are aspects of that we need to intertwine with the ITIL processes so that we can intertwine that. So the service request becomes a critical component of how we manage, how we request equipment, how we fulfill that equipment, how do we ensure that we're picking up equipment, how do we remove equipment, how do we decommission. All of those aspects are observed within the service request process, as well as, of course, configuration management around change and so on and so forth. So the critical component here is several aspects. One, of course, the key here is that the process as a whole, if we think about just hardware asset management, configuration management essentially takes place within the asset management process. We say that because, of course, asset management focuses on more aspects. It's a broader process than configuration management. And then as we go back to the definitions, configuration management is focused on understanding relationships. Well, understanding relationships are going to be focused on equipment that has already been deployed, right? And often that's where we run into troubles in a lot of the deployments that happen, is that folks will focus on deploying a discovery tool and then think that that's the end, that's where they have completed their activity. In reality, that's just the beginning, right? As we looked at from the pyramid perspective, the bottom of the pyramid is the asset repository. That's the building of your repository. That is essentially your discovery component, right? So in this case, essentially what we want to make sure is that that one, we understand which process we're looking at, because again, they're intertwined, but they are very different. And then two, that when we start to look at from a discovery perspective, that is the very beginning, right? And then from an asset management perspective, obviously, the first portion is around acquisition, so the ability to acquire that equipment and understand how we're bringing that equipment in, because of course that directly relates to, of course, the financial aspects. How did we procure that equipment? When did we procure that equipment? How do we, we can assign, once we procure that equipment, we can assign a life cycle to it. So we know now we then have established a process for retiring that equipment over time. So we now have a life cycle associated with equipment, of when it's ultimately going to be deployed, how long it should be in deployment, and then ultimately how do we phase that out and replace that equipment. So how do we keep our fleet of equipment up to date and manageable? And of course, that is a security concern as well. The older the equipment goes, the more issues we have with security around it. So of course, that's where we want to make sure that we keep our equipment as up to date as possible, right? Again, here, where we find, as I mentioned, we find more businesses, the asset configuration management project, that's where they find themselves as they think that they've completed their project, when in reality, that's really just the beginning. The process flow here from a configuration management perspective, our assets are a significant piece of the process. But again, from a configuration management perspective, it's just the beginning, right? It's just the add, move, change, if you will, once the devices have been deployed. And again, as we talked about earlier, configuration management is focusing on the relationships. Again, as we talked about, that all of that is around the first layer, and so forth. So let's go ahead and move on to the next.
Yeah, the next one is the demo. So before I jump in there, I just want to point out what Paul's slide here and this timeline. It's a little hard to demo in 5 minutes, but we're going to jump in this little slice right here. Oh, I think we got an open mic. In between stock and deploy. And I'm going to try to weave in how we got to stock and how we can get all the way to disposal. So let's drag over our asset management repository. I'm going to make that full screen. And here are our different storage locations because, in order to do stock management, you have to identify your cages or your storage rooms. When I was in IT, we had a cage in the basement. And so this would be our Boston cage where down in the basement, we've got these different assets locked up. And if a customer says, hey, I'm in need of, a new computer, I would like a new laptop, we can look at what's in stock within the storage location and see, okay, we've got 8 different laptops or 8 different devices. Double click on one of them, and here's an asset record that started in the procurement process. And the way that we know a little bit about this asset, first of all, you can see that its purchase date was the 31st of August. We expect our MacBooks to live for 36 months or 3 years. We expect it to be in stock in that storage location in Boston. And as we move along through some of these other tabs, once this gets out onto the network, we'll discover it and we'll be able to populate things like its IP address, its network information, its monitors, who's logged in. We haven't gotten there yet because this is still in stock. But if we come all the way over to some of our financial aspects, we can see that it's already linked back to a purchase order where I probably purchased additional MacBook Pros at the same time. So if we ever need to go back and see all of the machines that we bought off of that PO, we certainly can very quickly and easily by jumping to the purchase order. We have vendor information, purchase information. If it was a lease versus a full ownership, we would have that established based off of the way that we purchased the asset. Once we assign a chargeback owner, we'll start to do depreciation and automatically calculate the depreciation of that asset. And again, we've got its links back to the financial owner and so forth. So when it comes time to find one of these out, and maybe we issue this out to a user, and then later discovery comes along and it's discovered all of our machines on our network, right? It's discovered 222 desktops and 300 plus laptops and some virtuals. This is a view of all of the discovered assets in the environment, and we can just double click into any of these. So if we open up our list of laptops, we can double click into our Lenovo book here, our Chromebook, and see that this is assigned to Ali Admin, and Ali is supposed to be in the Boston location. This machine has been assigned a home use policy. It should always get a service level of P2 whenever it enters into a ticket. And we've got its information as far as when it was purchased and when it went into service and how long we expect it to live. And if you step up and scan it with the mobile app, with our barcode scanner, right, this app will come up and this record will come up in the app, and you'll be able to reassign it to a new user, check it back into stock, reassign it to a new location, or any of the other different asset lifecycle functions that you're going to perform. So things like bringing it back in for repair, right? Or reprovisioning it for a new user. Maybe it's part of a stock pool and it's a loaner and it gets checked in and checked out a lot, right? If it ever gets lost, we want to mark that and do our proper workflows and retrieve our police reports and, send a wipe command to the device, etc. Before it entered into our environment, it was on order. And we can receive it through the mobile app in our next update starting later on this month. And so all of these different life cycle states will help you manage that device as it ebbs and flows through its 36-month life cycle in my case, right? Ultimately, though, we're going to want to dispose of it, and we're going to want to dispose of it properly, because if it ever shows up in the green dumpster behind the bowling alley, right? Hopefully not. But if it does, because you sold it off to an employee or did it, let it go in a fire sale or didn't properly dispose of it, the EPA can trace that serial number back to you. And if you don't have a proper disposal certificate for it, you're liable as an organization for all the contaminants found within that asset. So there's mercury and lead and all sorts of other contaminants in the motherboard. It's $250,000 per contaminant found. it's not something that you want to show up in the green dumpster behind the bowling alley without a proper disposal certificate. So there's workflows in here for bringing it to a temporary location, removing its network, disabling its network accounts, reclaiming its software, wiping its disk, and then getting your disposal certificate before you let it go. And a lot of that can be automated, of course, but those are the types of workflows that are built into the box because they're built on the IA-ITAM best practice approaches. So that's a very abridged demonstration of a PC's life cycle, but hopefully it's a good understanding of what you can do with Ivanti. Let's see if we can answer some direct questions. Okay, I think we've answered a lot of questions about CAM. Third party, I think we did all those. Okay, okay, I think we got them all because I answered that one by hand. So yeah, great. I think maybe is it time to jump to the next poll question? Screenshot.
Actually, I think we have a question here. What about budget planning? These are current state details to develop 3 to 5 year budget plans. Can we show how we might be able to use a tool to do that?
Yeah, so we absolutely help with planning and budgeting. That's sort of an advanced level on that maturity pyramid because you really need to have your asset repository in place, your chargebacks and showbacks in place. But we absolutely can produce, trending and analysis to help you plan for budgets, tell you what you've consumed for, any from purchasing perspective, as well as, depreciated values as well.
Yeah, I mean, and what I would say is it's key to have the process components in place. You have to have the required data, obviously, in order to be able to make sure that you can extrapolate that information. So we need to understand when you purchase that equipment, possibly what service, what maintenance contacts are associated with that device. All of that kind of information will play a role in being able to look, that 2, 3 to 5 year looking forward sort of approach of understanding what your spend is going to look like. So one question here: does the computer asset screen that is shared come with all of the fields out of the box?
Yes, absolutely, it does. You can add unlimited number of fields as well. In Ivanti, all fields are created equal, but those are the ones we start you with.
Will the device discovery work across several domains?
It absolutely will. And depending on your network topology and configuration, you can have as many deployment representatives as needed. So if you have multiple networks, you can put, one in, the East Coast, one on the West Coast for network traffic, optimization.
Okay. And one more question here. If you have CAM and migrate to Ivanti, will the record be copied to Ivanti?
I'm not sure what record. Will the CAM record be copied into Ivanti? No, the device will be rediscovered through Ivanti.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we can of course migrate the data in the Steam2B, of course.
Yes.
That'll be migrated across, but
right.
Yeah.
And so from a CAM perspective, you can migrate to Ivanti Discovery and continue to use that with CAM. With Sharewell Service Management. So Ivanti Discovery works with Sharewell Service Management, and it'll also be available if and when you choose to migrate to Ivanti ITSM down the road.
Okay. And this is an interesting question. Would network micro segmentation, interface interfere with discovery? So I'm guessing that means much smaller networks than /24. So
yeah, so
VLAN,
it's all about your routing. If you can get from one microsegment to the other microsegment, then you're fine. If you've got firewalls and network traffic prevented between them, then multiple deployment representatives can be used.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Perfect. All right, and then lastly, for best practice number 3, this is really going to be talking about policy and governance, and really this is our people best practice, right? So governance is key when it comes to ITS and configuration management. As you saw from the process flow, I mean, obviously it's we need to have a process manager or process owner for each of the processes, especially, I mean, if you're focused on IT asset management, you need to have a process owner for IT asset management. That person is responsible for the overall success of that process, focused on, again, on the actual process itself. They are going to be act as the glue to ensure that any manual steps, because there often are going to be manual steps that'll need to be put in place as you mature your process and the tool catches up, that those manual steps can be followed. And at any point in time in the process, those steps are documented, and there's methods to quantify the effectiveness of the overall process. Really, the real purpose of the process owner is, again, to validate and ensure the effectiveness of that process. So again, this will move directly into our next demo, which is going to be focused around how do we quantify, how do we capture and look at whether or not we're following the processes that we have, right? These resources are responsible for the continuous service improvement of the process as well. So again, the expectation is that when you go live with this initial process, you may not be at the full level of maturity at that point. So there will be some manual steps that need to be managed. And there will also be a process for continuous improvement. So you may expand the scope of your process or the depth of your process, right? So again, it's important to have this process owner in place so that you can continually improve your process and make it better over time. All right, I think we'll go ahead and move right into the.
Yeah, well, one of the ways that you'll be able to continuously improve your process over time is being able to measure it and report upon it. So there's a couple of reporting tools that I'm going to bring up today. The first one here is going to be your operational perspective. So if you're an asset manager and you're living in the product all the time, there are dashboards that are really designed to help you do your day-to-day function. This procurement dashboard will help you track and manage all of the open procurement POs that you have going on. What are you receiving? What are you expecting? Right? There's a contract dashboard if you're responsible for renewals, for making sure that all of your contracts are properly managed. There's an asset manager dashboard that just gives you a nice breakdown of where are all of my assets? Who has the most chargeback of all of those assets? What is the breakdown by type, and which ones haven't been scanned in a few weeks, right? But here's a great one. This one really brings together everything that Paul has been talking about today, which is implementing the process. The discovery tool is going to get you so far. The processes are going to get you the rest of the way. So this dashboard is designed to help you enforce those processes. Here's one called our asset location exception. This computer has been flagged to our exceptions dashboard, and if we double click into it, we'll know why. We expect this computer to be in stock in the London facility. That's where it should be. Discovery has squealed and determined that actually Susie Davis is using it right now in Frankfurt. We know that because its IP address maps back to the Frankfurt location. So we're expecting it in stock in London. We're actually found that Susie uses it in Frankfurt. Why? Maybe somebody issued Susie this laptop and forgot to update the record. That happens. Maybe Susie grabbed it when nobody was looking. Either way, we need to get in touch with Susie and figure out what happened. So those are your operational dashboards. That's just a couple of my favorites. Then we have some really high-level dashboards for executive reporting, for being able to understand, like, what am I forecasting? What's the breakdown of all the users with assets? What business units have the most assets, right? Being able to do executive level reporting and dashboarding. These dashboards can all be delivered to the leadership team, on a schedule, Monday at 9, Friday at 5, whatever format you like. They can also just be thrown up on big overhead screens and be refreshing all the time. We give you whole fleets of them out of the box, but you can drag and drop your own together to make your own dashboards. So this is our extraction platform. It comes with the Ivanti ITSM and ITAM solutions, and it's a fantastic way of getting the output out of the system, which is really the evidence to help you measure and quantify what you're doing. So trying to keep it on time. Looks like we're right at 1 o'clock. guess it's, we have one last poll question. And oh yeah, so what we showed today, well, from a building blocks perspective, right? We showed the the Ivanti Neurons platform, which included the discovery solution, and then we also showed the Ivanti Asset Management, ITAM, which includes the life cycle management, the ability to do procurement, the ability to do stock management, and a lot of the more advanced things, contract. Being able to forecast and better budgeting and project management, all that is handled in the ITAM product. So there's really two components. Neurons is kind of like its name implies. It's the brains behind the operation. It does all the device discovery, reconciliation, deduplication. The ITAM solution is really the bronze. That's where you're going to do your day-to-day life cycle management and ongoing tracking of your devices. Okay, our last question, poll question. Does your company have an automated discovery solution? So are you using anything to help automatically find those devices out there today? Fantastic. Boy, you guys stuck with us right to the end. Thanks for, again, great participation. Looks like vast majority of you are using something, so that's great. Hopefully it's providing some value, and hopefully you'll see that it can be leveraged what you have today within the Ivanti solution. And you know, maybe perhaps there's additional value that we can provide in helping you on your asset management journey.
Listen, I want to thank everyone for hanging in there today. I know we're running just a little bit over. I would like to, we'll stop the poll here in just a second, but I would like to let everybody know that 2 weeks from today, we've got our next session. We're going to go through and kind of take a next step up the maturity curve, if you will. So it's really around walking, getting to the level 2, really specifically around analysis and action for IT configuration management. There's some of the topics that we'll cover. Please join us and we'll kind of take the next step in the journey. So again, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Rob, for flying through all that great material. There's a lot there. Hopefully you all have learned a lot, and hopefully we'll see you on our next session.
Thanks
Great.
so much. And I'll take
Thanks,
the time
everyone.
to answer any of these open questions in the Q&A. I'll type in chat answers. So I'll be doing that right now.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye.